Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Celine, and today I would like to talk a little bit about books about medieval women. This is a time period that I've been dabbling in a little bit recently, because my own background as a historian is in the 19th century, so to me the Middle Ages are like a whole new world. In terms of timings, the Middle Ages go from roughly, it really depends on who you ask, but roughly from 500 to 1500. Which obviously is a massive amount of time. So there are a lot of discussions amongst historians about should we even call this one period one thing? Because it gives the impression that nothing changed in 1,000 years, which is very much not the case. Like, there were tons of developments, and the idea that these were the Dark Ages, in my opinion, just doesn't really hold ground. I think there's so much to explore in this time period. And these are just some books that I read fairly recently that I thought were really interesting and that I wanted to share with you. I would quite recommend Joan of Arc by Helen Castor. If we're talking about medieval women, I think Joan of Arc might possibly be the most famous medieval woman. She's a really fascinating figure. So she was a peasant girl, she came from just a farming family, and at some point found herself commanding armies and breaking the siege of Orleans at this time. In order to understand why Joan of Arc happened and how that all fit together politically, I think Helen Castor has done a really good job of showing the political context at this time. So there's a lot happening with war between England and France, and part of France has turned into English France. But then there's also a lot of infighting between two sides within France. And then one of those two sides, the Burgundian part, is also really active in the Low Countries, or the Netherlands, which is where I'm from. But all of that is really complicated, and there is a lot going on. So the first 90 pages of this book are basically trying to explain to you all of these different factions, all of the people that are implicated in this really bloody conflict in the 15th century of France. So I do think if you start reading this book and you're like, where's Joan of Arc? I think it's useful to know that the first section is just about the political context. And I think sometimes it felt like that section was perhaps a little bit long, but it does set the stage properly for when Joan of Arc arrives on the page for her to shine. So I wouldn't say that this book is exactly a biography, because it's not really like a journey of her from childhood up through, you know, the things that happened in that military conflict. It is very much a historical book about the conflict as a whole. Now, with Joan of Arc, one of the interesting things is, of course, the trial of Joan of Arc. So she eventually got captured and she was put on trial for heresy. And then later that trial was overturned and she became a saint of the Catholic Church. So there's just a lot of really interesting history. Like, it touches on religion, it touches on politics, military history, but also, of course, the history of women. And I'm really glad that I read this book. And I do think that Helen Castor has a really nice writing style. She's very good at making this story feel alive. And sometimes her writing is really dense, and not necessarily in the sense that the language is difficult, but there are just so many facts and so many people that it can be a little bit like, oh gosh, wow, okay, that's a lot of information on one page. But at the end of the book, I did really feel like I understood a lot more about this conflict. If we are talking about medieval women, then I feel like I just have to talk about this book, which is called Medieval Women, which is by Henrietta Leyser, and it is subtitled A Social History of Women in England from 450 to 1500. If you are even remotely interested in this topic, I feel like this is one of the best books that you can read. It is quite accessible. It is an academic work, so it's dense, there's a ton of information, but it's also so comprehensive, and because the topic is really fascinating and the chapters aren't too long, I did feel like I learned so much from this book. One thing that I really appreciated is that it takes both a long historical period, so it does, you know, take like the full 1,000 years, and on top of that, it focuses on all the layers of society. So this is a book which isn't just focused on court politics or just the top 1% of society. This is very much a book that talks also about farmers' wives, that talks about, for example, women who lived in convents and very different sections of society. Now, this book is from 1995, so I'm sure that in a lot of ways, a lot of research has moved on and a lot more has been found out. But at the same time, this book is so comprehensive and gives you such an interesting spectrum of research that I still feel like this is actually a great place to start. One of my favourite chapters in this book was the one about female mystics. Because in the medieval period, there were a lot of women who would say like, oh, I have been visited by God or by an archangel or something like that, and God has told me to do XYZ. And Joan of Arc is one of those people as well, because she was also one of those people who had a divine mission, or at least claimed to do so. I'm not going to be the person who determines whether or not this is true. But I think socially, that is such an interesting dynamic. And it is one of the ways that women could find power. And there is a chapter about that phenomenon in this book that I thought was just absolutely fascinating. And it made me really interested in reading more about female mystics. So yes, definitely recommend Medieval Women. And then finally, if you're like, I would like to read something that was written by a medieval woman, I really recommend the Lais by Marie de France. I've got this Dutch edition that I read for my undergrad, but there are tons of just really accessible editions of this collection. Marie de France lived in 12th century France, and she wrote these lays, which are sort of like, they're almost like fairy tales perhaps. They were written in verse, but some translations put them into prose. This is a prose edition as well. And she wrote particularly about courtly life. So she wrote about courtly love, about chivalry, about all of the topics that we really associate with medieval life. So not very much the nitty-gritty of, you know, life as a farmer if you were a peasant, but very much about the knights and the ladies and their favors and stuff like that. And what I really enjoyed about these stories is that they're still quite fun and interesting, and they still resonate in some odd way even now, even though it's been, you know, a good 800 years since they were written. I think it's really cool that we can still read these stories, and they are quite short, so that does make them accessible, from so long ago, and that we can still enjoy them. And then I also have a couple more books that I haven't read yet, or that I'm actually in the middle of reading, and the first one of these is She-Wolves, again by Helen Castor. Now, the idea of this book is that in 1533, Queen Elizabeth became the first queen that ruled England. But before that, there were other women who did hold great power in England. And this is basically a sort of biography of 4 of those women. So the women this book talks about are Matilda, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, and Margaret of Anjou. And again, this is well written, well researched, so fascinating to see how medieval women were just as ruthless as medieval men and how they all scrapped for power. I think a documentary was also made about this book, so that is something that I look forward to watching when I've actually finished this one. And then finally, I also have this edition of the letters between 2 medieval figures, which were Heloise and Abelard. These were 2 people who lived in France during the medieval period, and their love letters are seen as one of the best examples of love letters in perhaps the history of love letters. I think Heloise ended up in a convent, and they had this correspondence going on, and, you know, lots of longing and wonderfully lush writing. This is also something that I quite look forward to reading, because I think it's so fascinating to read love letters from history, because in a lot of ways the connection between people definitely stands the test of time. And letters have a tendency to still feel really personal, even though they were written hundreds of years ago. So yeah, definitely looking forward to this one as well. So those are some books on medieval women that I just wanted to share with you today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have a favourite medieval figure, do let me know. I'm always curious to hear about these types of things. I hope to see you again soon in the next video. Bye!